Dr. Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And never before has so much pride been displayed by so few in such a short space of time. It's been quite galling. That was one of the longest contributions that we've had at a second reading on a bill going through urgency, where it's not having the scrutiny that we would expect of Parliament under normal circumstances in terms of the select committee stage. And it is frankly an arrogant government that thinks that it can rush through legislation at this pace, even under urgency, without giving legislation a full debate and a full airing. We've heard some fantastical explanations why. There's Mr Ducey, who thinks that magically houses are going to grow overnight if only this is passed. We'll wake up in the morning and throughout the land there will have sprouted houses into which the good people can move. There is a naivety in this government that is showing through in this legislation, Mr Speaker. We are hearing over and over and over again the panic that has set into this government with this piece of legislation. There's been some polling, they've seen there's a problem. Their inaction on housing over their 7 years in government, yet here we are pushing through a half measure that is only enabling something that isn't going to help the situation, is the only solution they've come up with. Other suggestions that they've had around housing seem to have disappeared, such as the much touted during the election campaign, the much touted at the beginning of this year, RMA reforms. That was going to be the silver bullet for housing in New Zealand. Now, we're still waiting for Dr Smith to show us those reforms, because we've actually said, show us them, put them on the table. And you know what? If there's some stuff that will help with housing, we'll look at it. Let's use the mechanism of a national policy statement, and that we could actually perhaps join with you and work with that. But has National fronted up and shown us? No, because this is a government that does not have answers around housing. This is a government that has got empty ideological rhetoric that isn't going to make a blind bit of difference to the lives of ordinary New Zealanders. Now, what we've had tonight touted, starting with the Prime Minister and echoed through all the research note speeches, is a clear commitment to compassionate conservatism coming from the government benches. The compassionate conservatism that they believe they are displaying seems to have evolved that actually that translates into the big society. One of them let it slip, but I think he got it wrong and called it big community. The word that your overseas overlords use is big society when talking about this. But National Party members need to actually have a look about what compassionate conservatism is. We actually have had national parties in the past in this country that have practiced compassionate conservatism. What is happening in this House tonight and in this legislation is not the conservatism of Sid Holland. It is not the conservatism of Keith Holyoake. When those leaders of the National Party sought to remove the state from housing, they looked to sell houses to the individuals that lived in those houses. They didn't look to flog them off to their mates that could offer, in the corporate sector, to put people into corporate overlords. This is the Cabinet Club conservatism, as my colleague Phil Twyford called it, that underwrote the 1990 market rentals that Ruth Richardson put in place. Do not kid yourself that this is any form of compassionate conservatism. When compassionate conservatism started to be touted by right-wing parties, it was Bush that first started using it. He abandoned it pretty much after 9/11 and just went into plain old kick him in the guts right-wingism, actually. But compassionate conservatism does not look back to your roots. You are a party that has been better than that, and Mr Speaker, I'm sure you are as well. But the National Party does have a history that is rooted in some belief in that. But what we are seeing display of tonight is not that. This is a return to the 1990s and a belief that you can sell state houses off to anyone. Now, we've started with the fiction that this was legislation to enable state housing to be sold to the community sector in some hope of achieving their big society. Well, the problem that we're seeing here, as we have in many places, is the key providers in that sector said, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. That we do not believe that state house tenants will be better served under this model than they could be with the government providing. So we don't want a part of that. And what have we had now? That we've had Bill English saying that yes, that we could be seeing some of these being sold to private property developers. They've tried to dress this up as something that this isn't. This is pure and simple a flogging off of our state houses. And what else are we saying? Not only is the government divesting itself of the ownership of the housing, it's divesting the Housing New Zealand from some of the core policy functions and thinking that needs to go into this. That we will no longer see Housing New Zealand having a policy function. We will not have a dedicated part of our government that tries to put the bits of housing policy together. Instead, we're going to see a continuation of the approach that we've seen with the functions spread and splintered across government, and that it doesn't have a coherence that has tenants at the centre and the well-being of the tenants at the centre. My colleague Phil Twyford put it very well when he talked about a state-owned version of Barfoot and Thompson, that we will have a state-owned letting agency, not a government department that is dedicated to doing what we expect Housing New Zealand to do and what its function should be. And Mr Speaker, that is a very sad day for New Zealand. Because what we used to have in this country is a belief that a core part of the safety net that we provided for our citizens was housing. And housing that would mean that people wouldn't have to go homeless. And I think what we're going to hear through the course of this debate, Mr Speaker, is examples from all around the country that we can speak of, where we have constituents who are not being well served. But what is most upsetting for us, Mr Speaker, is these very same constituents are going to be even worse served under the changes that we hear under urgency made tonight. There is nothing in this legislation that is going to do our tenants back. Instead, what we have is an ideological commitment to selling houses off to whoever the right bidder they can find is. The shortage of housing is getting worse, and other speakers from this side of the House have alluded to the fact that selling houses doesn't create more houses. I think my colleague Annette King chose to point out that selling them off isn't going to magically create more houses any more than passing legislation under urgency, Mr Ducey, will allow for houses to magically appear on the landscape of New Zealand. That what we have to have and what we are not having from this government is a proper commitment to the government ensuring that New Zealanders are housed. Something that we think is a pretty basic role of government and something that we are committed to doing. And just simply passing the buck onto the community sector who doesn't want a bar of it is not responsible government in this area. Passing the buck and abrogating themselves of their responsibility as a government is not good enough. But what is more galling, Mr Speaker, is where I started. That these are a group of people that are trying to kid themselves that this is some kind of compassionate conservatism. This is a return to their 1990 roots, not their roots in the past, in the 1960s and the 1950s, where actually there was a grain of truth in the fact that the National Party in New Zealand did exercise a kind of compassionate conservatism. There was a belief in the role of the state. There was a belief that they needed to do right by New Zealanders. We are not seeing that in this legislation, Mr Speaker. What we are seeing is a government that is walking away from one of its core responsibilities, and that is providing adequate housing. It is a government that is out of ideas. It is a government that is poll-driven, and what we're seeing here tonight is not going to solve anything.